I want you to imagine a scenario right now. Just close your eyes for a second. I mean, if you aren't driving, obviously. And imagine waking up tomorrow morning, you grab your phone off the nightstand, and you log into your banking app.
Always a stressful moment for most people.
Oh, absolutely. But instead of that familiar knot in your stomach as you check your balances, you see something that, well, it sounds like an absolute pure fantasy.
Like a glitch in the matrix.
Yeah, exactly. Your student loans erased, your credit card balances completely wiped clean, that massive mortgage hanging over your head, gone. Just zero balance, a perfectly clean slate.
Man, I mean, it sounds like the ultimate economic relief valve, you know? Just a spontaneous global reset where everyone just gets to breathe again.
Right. It sounds like an absolute utopia. But as we all know, whenever a deal seems too good to be true, especially in the complex world of global finance, there is always a catch. And today we are going to look at the ultimate catch. Our mission for this deep dive is to analyze a massive stack of macroeconomic white papers, policy discussions, and official documents from global institutions. We're talking places like the World Economic Forum and the International Monetary Fund.
Heavy hitters.
Exactly. And we are looking at a concept circulating in these papers known as a debt jubilee, or more broadly, the Great Reset.
And I think it is critical to understand right off the bat that these aren't just, theoretical musings or internet rumors.
Right, they're not just message board theories.
No, not at all. These are highly detailed contingency plans. They're drafted by the actual architects of global finance, and they're attempting to address a very real mathematical reality about the state of our world right now.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our objective today is to explore exactly how the global financial system reached a point of mathematical unsustainability. We want to know what this proposed forgiveness actually entails mechanically, and what the profound costs embedded in the fine print really are.
Because the fine print is where it gets you.
Right. Because according to these sources, the proposed solution isn't just about forgiving your debt. It's about a fundamental rewiring of what it means to, well, own anything at all.
Yeah. And to understand the Great Reset, we really have to look backwards first. We have to look at the past 5 decades of global debt.
Which is a lot of debt to cover.
It's a massive amount of debt. I mean, the crisis these white papers are trying to solve was essentially engineered over half a century. The documents point to a massive shift that occurred when the U.S. dollar was officially decoupled from the gold standard.
Okay, I want to pause there for a second because we hear the term fiat currency a lot.
Sure.
Constantly. But I don't think everyone really understands the mechanics of that shift. I mean, when you decouple from gold, you are essentially transitioning the entire globe from a system where money represents a physical finite asset to a fiat currency model. And in that model, money is essentially created into existence through issuing debt.
Yeah, that is the core mechanism.
Yeah.
Under a fiat system, your economic growth becomes totally reliant on continuous credit expansion.
Right.
But the real accelerator, like the point of no return according to the data in these sources, was the global financial crisis of 2008.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, following that crash, central banks around the world engaged in unprecedented quantitative easing.
Now, I remember reading about quantitative easing back then, but walk us through how that actually works in practice. Like, how does a central bank policy in 2008 lead to the crisis these white papers are trying to solve today?
Right. So when a central bank engages in quantitative easing, they're essentially creating new money out of thin air, basically.
Just typing it into a computer.
Exactly. And they use it to buy massive amounts of government bonds and other securities from commercial banks.
Right.
This floods the financial markets with incredibly cheap capital, and it artificially suppresses interest rates. The goal at the time was just to keep the global economy from flatlining.
Right, I remember that panic.
But by doing that, they created a massive asset bubble.
Well, because if you pump that much cheap money into the top of the financial system, it doesn't automatically flow down into the average worker's paycheck.
No, precisely the opposite, actually.
Yeah.
The commercial banks and massive institutions that get access to this nearly free money, they don't use it to double everyone's wages.
Obviously not.
Right. They use it to buy assets.
Yeah.
So we saw real estate prices, equities, and essential commodities absolutely skyrocket.
Mm-hmm.
Asset values completely detached from the reality of median wage growth.
Which, for the average person, remained totally stagnant.
Exactly. Totally flat.
You essentially have a situation where the cost of simply existing is going up exponentially, but the actual value of a day's labor it's frozen in time.
Yeah.
And the sources point out how this has disproportionately targeted specific demographics, particularly millennials and Gen Z.
Oh, without a doubt.
We're talking about generations who were sold this pervasive narrative that higher education was the absolute only path to survival. So they took on trillions of dollars in non-dischargeable student loan debt.
Just crushing amounts of debt.
Right.
Yeah.
Only to enter a workforce where their paycheck barely covers the interest.
And then, when they finally managed to scrape together enough for a down payment, they walked into a housing market that had been completely transformed.
Yeah, it wasn't the same market their parents bought into.
Not at all. They aren't just bidding against other families for a starter home anymore. They were bidding against institutional investors and massive private equity firms.
Who have endless pockets.
Exactly. Firms who are using that same artificially cheap central bank capital we just talked about to buy up single-family homes in bulk.
It makes me think of a rigged game of musical chairs.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Right. It's like the economy is this grand game, but the institutional think tanks and private equity firms have been systematically walking around the room just removing all the chairs.
Yep.
And when the music inevitably stops, an entire generation of the middle class is left standing. They're permanently transitioned into a renting class because there's simply nothing left to sit on.
What's fascinating here is that the global institutions drafting these white papers actually recognize this dynamic.
Really? They admit it.
They do. They look at this exact scenario where household debt reaches a point where the cost of simply servicing the interest exceeds the productive output of the citizens, and they see an economic singularity.
A singularity. Wow.
Yeah, a point where the math simply breaks. Historically, this brings us to the ancient Mesopotamian concept of a debt jubilee.
It's incredible to think that this idea of wiping the slate clean is thousands of years old. I mean, how did it work back then?
So in ancient agrarian societies, if a farmer took out a loan for seeds and there was, say, a sudden drought, compound interest would eventually crush them.
Because they couldn't grow anything to pay it back.
Right. And if a critical mass of the population defaulted, the agricultural base would fail and the entire society would just collapse.
Yeah.
So kings would periodically declare a jubilee, a total forgiveness of debt.
Just wiping the slate clean.
Yeah. Exactly. To reset the board, prevent a revolution, and keep the society functioning. The sources reveal that modern global institutions view our current debt crisis through that exact same lens.
Wait, they think we're at that breaking point.
They do. A systemic default isn't just a risk to them. They view it as mathematically inevitable. So instead of letting the system collapse chaotically and taking their institutional power down with it, they're drafting contingency plans for a controlled demolition of the old financial paradigm.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate here.
Sure.
If a mathematical collapse is inevitable and they are planning to essentially demolish the system,
Right.
How do global institutions plan to sell that to the public?
That's the trick, isn't it?
Because you can't just go on television and say, hey, everyone, our policies broke the math of the global economy, so we're going to blow it up and start over. People would panic. There would be a massive run on the banks.
They absolutely would, which is why the white papers emphasize that the transition relies heavily on a specific kind of psychological framing.
PR.
Exactly. If you read the language in these documents, it is highly sanitized. It is cloaked in the language of altruism and collective progress.
The buzzwords are definitely everywhere in these pages. I noticed that. Terms like stakeholder capitalism, sustainable equity, and building back better.
Right. Very soothing.
It all sounds very communal and positive. But the core doctrine buried in the text aligns with that phrase we've all heard debated online. You will owe nothing, and you will be happy. The authors seem to be framing the abolition of private ownership not as a devastating loss of personal wealth, but as a liberation from the burden of liability.
Yes. And the authors note that this framing only becomes acceptable to the public if the population is desperate enough for relief.
Desperate. Okay.
The sources detail a deeply unsettling concept, a state of chronic psychological fatigue. The documents suggest that by continuously amplifying narratives of impending climate catastrophes, insurmountable economic inequality, and global health emergencies, a state of exhaustion is induced in the general population.
Some analysts call that a polycrisis, right?
Yes, exactly.
You essentially wear people down by making sure multiple massive crises overlap all at once. You create an environment where the average person is doom scrolling through inflation reports and supply chain failures until everything just feels like it's on fire all the time.
That exhaustion is the catalyst.
Yeah.
A terrified, fatigued, public-facing frozen bank withdrawals or hyperinflation won't fight a controlled demolition of the financial system.
They'll just want it to stop.
Exactly. According to the strategic outlines in these papers, they will eventually beg for it. They will demand intervention. And that is exactly when the modern debt jubilee is introduced as the savior.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. I want to get into the actual physical mechanics of this because this is where my mind gets stuck.
Right, let's do it.
Let's say I'm that exhausted citizen. I have a $500,000 mortgage with a commercial bank that I can't afford, and I have $50,000 in credit card debt.
Very common scenario.
Right. And the government steps in and offers to wipe it all to zero. What exactly am I signing away? And mechanically, how does a global central trust suddenly own my split-level ranch?
The mechanism detailed in the peripheral white papers relies on a massive debt-for-asset swap during a period of intense banking distress.
Okay.
Imagine a scenario where commercial banks are facing mass defaults because of this polycrisis. To prevent a total collapse, the central banks step in to bail them out. But unlike 2008, where they just bought the bad debt and let the banks keep operating normally, this contingency plan requires the underlying assets to be transferred to a sovereign wealth trust.
So it doesn't just disappear.
No. In exchange for the central authority assuming your personal debt liability, you must sign over the deed to your property, the title to your vehicle, and your equity portfolios to this central trust.
Wait. So my commercial bank is bailed out, my debt is erased, and I get to stay in my house, but I don't actually own it anymore.
That is the trade-off outlined in the proposal. You are permitted to use the assets, you sleep in the house, you drive the car, but legally you transition from being an owner to a tenant of the state.
Wow.
And to facilitate this day-to-day living, the documents outline that citizens are granted a universal basic income, or UBI. This UBI covers your basic living expenses and, crucially, your new permanent rental fees to the state for the assets you used to own.
Okay, that is a breathtaking transfer of wealth. I mean, just conceptually. But logistically, if citizens are transitioned into state tenants living on a universal basic income, how is a massive rent-based society actually managed? I mean, who collects the rent?
Right, so the universal basic income proposed in these documents isn't handed out in paper cash, and it isn't deposited via a traditional bank transfer like we have today.
Okay.
It is distributed exclusively through a central bank digital currency, or CBDC. And the white papers make a very clear distinction here.
Mm-hmm.
A CBDC is fundamentally different from the digital money you use right now.
I'm looking at the section on the programmable ledger, and I have to admit, I'm a little stuck. Because when I buy a coffee with my phone right now, isn't that already a digital ledger? How is a CBDC fundamentally different?
It's a really great question, because they look identical to the end user.
Yeah.
You tap your phone, you get a coffee.
Right.
The difference is the underlying architecture. Existing digital money is just an electronic representation of fiat currency. A commercial bank manages that ledger. A CBDC is a programmable ledger issued directly by the central bank. It has smart contracts baked right into the protocol level, meaning the money itself contains executable code.
So the issuer can embed behavioral rules directly into the currency itself.
Exactly. This introduces behavioral economics on a staggering scale.
Oh, man.
The sources reveal that if the currency is programmable, the central authority can dictate what you can buy, where you can travel, and what media you consume based on algorithmic rules.
Just fully automated control.
Yes. For instance, the documents discuss automated penalties. If you violate a localized carbon emission quota, say, your wallet's algorithm calculates you've purchased too much red meat this month, or you purchase fuel beyond your allotted radius. Your digital wallet could be temporarily frozen from buying certain items, or your UBI could be automatically reduced.
It's like living inside a digital video game.
That's a great comparison.
If you don't play by the exact rules of the server, the developers can just mute your inventory or pause your character. You step out of line, and the system just grays out your ability to buy a plane ticket or purchase groceries.
Yeah, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, you really have to look at the sheer scale of managing that kind of system.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Logistically, tracking the individual carbon footprint of 2 billion people buying coffee and groceries in real time sounds completely unworkable. Human bureaucrats couldn't possibly monitor that.
Humanly, it is completely unworkable, which is why the enforcement outlined in these documents relies heavily on artificial intelligence. Yeah, the sources explicitly detail partnerships where massive Silicon Valley technology conglomerates are actively building this algorithmic infrastructure in synchronicity with global financial institutions. To manage billions of programmable wallets in real time, it requires a fully autonomous algorithmic architecture.
So with the mechanics laid bare, the fiat debt squeeze, the psychological fatigue of the poly crisis, the bailout asset swap, and this AI-driven programmable money, we need to look at the profound moral debate surrounding this policy.
Yes, we do.
Because these sources are actually deeply divided, and we need to look at both sides of this dialectic impartially. There are brilliant sociologists and economists in these texts who argue strongly for this reset.
They do. The argument advocating for the reset is rooted in a very pragmatic critique of our current system, and honestly, it shouldn't be dismissed lightly.
Right. The authors on this side of the debate argue that hypercapitalism is already fundamentally broken. They point out that wealth is already concentrated in the hands of a microscopic elite, and billions of people are suffering immensely under the weight of this unpayable debt.
Which is demonstrably true.
Exactly. From their perspective, a radical redistribution, even if it means transitioning everyone into a rental-based society under strict state control, might actually alleviate that immense suffering. They argue that ensuring everyone has guaranteed housing, food, and basic income via a managed transition is infinitely preferable to a violent, chaotic, and bloody collapse of the global economy.
It is a very compelling argument. I mean, especially when you look at the human cost of severe economic depressions historically.
Right.
If you are a family facing foreclosure and starvation, guaranteed state housing sounds like absolute salvation. However, the white papers also contain a fierce rebuttal from opposing economists and sociologists.
And what is the crux of their counterargument?
Well, the critics analyze the framing of the reset and argue that it is a deliberately constructed false dichotomy.
Meaning they're forcing a choice that doesn't actually exist?
Right. By presenting the global population with only a binary choice, either we face chaotic, apocalyptic ruin, or we accept their authoritarian salvation, the institutions conveniently ignore a third option.
Which is what? What's the alternative they're proposing?
The decentralization of financial power.
Okay.
The critics argue for a return to sound money principles, allowing the market to naturally correct by letting over-leveraged institutions fail rather than bailing them out. They argue for aggressively prosecuting the institutional market manipulation that caused the asset bubbles in the first place.
Right. Hold the people at the top accountable.
Exactly. The rebuttal essentially states that global institutions don't get to break the economy with reckless policy and then demand absolute control over human behavior as the only possible fix.
So what does this all mean? When you strip away the modern jargon, all the stakeholder capitalism, and the programmable digital ledgers, the critics in these sources point to a very stark historical parallel. They argue we are essentially talking about the return of neo-feudalism.
Yes. And the historical mapping they provide is quite striking, really. If you look at the medieval era, peasants owned absolutely nothing.
Right, the lords owned it all.
Exactly. They worked land that was owned entirely by lords. In exchange for their labor, the lords provided them with meager rations and physical protection from outside threats.
And the peasants were entirely dependent. There was absolutely no mechanism for upward mobility.
None whatsoever. Now, the critics map that exact structure to the proposed Great Reset. In this modern model, the lords are the global central banks and the asset management monoliths.
Okay.
The land they control is the global housing market, the energy grid, and the supply chains. And the rations. The rations are the programmable digital tokens doled out as universal basic income, which dictate what you can and cannot consume.
According to this rebuttal, the structure of absolute power remains identical to the medieval era. It completely eliminates the concept of upward mobility.
It really does.
It eliminates generational wealth. I mean, you can't leave a house to your children if you're just renting it from the central trust. The wealth is consolidated at the absolute top of the pyramid forever.
The terminology has certainly evolved to sound much more progressive, but the critics maintain that the underlying mechanism of subjugation is largely static.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to recap the main takeaway for you, the listener, based on the diverse viewpoints in these sources. The impending financial realignment described in these macroeconomic white papers is designed to be the largest transfer of sovereign wealth in human history.
Massive.
According to the documents, when the next major crisis hits and this plan is rolled out, the mainstream narrative will likely present it as a historic victory for the working class. You will see emotional stories of people finally freed from their crushing burdens. But as the financial critics in these papers remind us, Wealth is almost never truly destroyed. It is only transferred.
And that transfer, mechanically speaking, is often a one-way street. Once hard assets are relinquished for programmable relief, reversing that transaction becomes incredibly difficult, if not totally impossible.
Which is why the ultimate takeaway from these sources is the importance of understanding the fundamental difference between programmable debt instruments, money that comes with behavioral strings attached, and intrinsic sovereign wealth, which are things you actually own and control outright. When the pressure mounts and you are offered a clean slate, it is vital to read the fine print.
And before we sign off, there is one final piece of the puzzle tucked away in the governance section of these white papers that we want to leave you with. This raises an important question.
Right, because if a central global trust successfully absorbs the deeds, the titles, and the equity of the entire global population in exchange for erasing their debt, who exactly holds the voting power on the board of that central trust?
Good question.
And even more critically, what happens to you, the permanent tenant, if the state itself eventually defaults on its own obligations?
Just something to mull over the next time you check your bank balance.
We'll see you on the next deep dive.